Well, let's discuss this further with Nevenka Tromp. She is a lecturer in Eastern European Studies at the University of Amsterdam and also an executive director of the Jeffrey Nice Foundation, which focuses on international criminal justice delivered by the courts. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Thank you for your time. First of all, your reaction to this ruling today by the court.
Well, I don't think it really came as a surprise because there were all indicators that and media and human rights organizations were onto the topic and were pursuing it since the first media reports came out that the Dutch government is exporting to Israel essential parts for F-35s, the fighting aircrafts, and that these have been used in the war that Israel launched to Gaza.
However, in December, a district court ruled that supplying parts to Israel or any part of the world was primarily a political decision and that judges should not interfere with that. So that's been overruled. What's your gut feeling about how this will fare when it gets to the Supreme Court?
I think the arguments in discussion is very clear. Every national court, regardless of its political and economic interests, is actually and has to adhere to human rights and international humanitarian law. It supersedes any political and economic interest. And certainly when we regard an ongoing conflict where there is beyond any doubt, as we see as every day in the news, Israel has been engaging in disproportionate use of violence in Gaza that affects mostly civilians, and then doing it behind the reasoning that it is actually the violence against Hamas in order to destruct Hamas as a terrorist organization, as Israel explains. So this ruling is extremely important, not just for the Netherlands and its act and behavior in these sort of ways, providing essential military equipment to a party in the war that is engaged in violation of international humanitarian law. And do not forget, this is also playing in a backdrop of ICJ case, the highest and most important court in the world, the Court of UN, that actually is now engaged in a proceedings in which it needs to determine whether Israel is actually also committing a crime of genocide. So the Netherlands as a state has a very important role to play, and the Dutch courts as well. And I'm happy to say that in a state as the Netherlands, you see that division of powers work very well, that the decision-making and influence by public is very important, and that we see not just rule of law in its best, but we also can see that legal governance with its instruments can very much influence the behavior of executive power. And I think it is a very good day for all of us who believe in international liberal system that is governed by rules and by law.
And do you think this is a trend that may continue? Not so long ago, a human rights group in New York sued Joe Biden, the US president, for allegedly failing in his duty under international law to prevent Israel from committing, in their words, genocide. Do you expect that this trend may continue where individuals or NGOs take their own governments to court to try to effect change?
Absolutely. You see, we, since 1948, since the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and Covenants from 1966, we actually live in the age of human rights. And what's fascinating about the human rights and different but yet associated development of the law, it's international humanitarian law, that it is actually ownership of any individuals and NGOs, non-governmental organizations that have a sole purpose to actually be arbiters in the societies between individuals, groups, our interests, and the interests of the state. They do not always coincide and overlap. So I think this is a huge empowerment in a functioning democracies where rule of law is not just some ornament to parade with, but we can see that rule of law in this country, in the Netherlands, really works. And of course, it would be wonderful if other NGOs, associations of citizens, actually take these instruments that Age of Human Rights gave us and start these sort of actions that can make huge difference, because the Netherlands as a state will now have to think twice before actually by some political reasoning support a side in the war that is engaged and crosses the line what is allowed by international humanitarian law in ongoing conflict. Absolutely, yes.
And that's a very interesting point, because when we're talking about the politics of all this, the Dutch Prime Minister, Mark Rutte, is currently in Israel. He's having meetings with Benjamin Netanyahu, and I know that he has come under fire. He's been criticised, hasn't he, for being soft on Israel, some people say, to try and further his own chances of becoming the next NATO Secretary General. So do you read anything into the timing of this decision by the appeals court, given that criticism of the Prime Minister?
Yes, definitely. It is not a coincidence that Mark Rutte is there, and it's not coincidence that he is aspiring very seriously to become next Secretary General of NATO. And, you know, if he really wants to become next Secretary General of NATO, whose support he needs at most? The support of United States of America. And if United States of America is supporting Israel in the way they do, then the Dutch government with Mark Rutte still in function is not going to do something else than to support what America has as its own state politics. It's interesting that he went there, he met Netanyahu, and one of the messages to Netanyahu obviously was to respect humanitarian law and allow humanitarian aid, which is actually euphemism what he should be asking Netanyahu to do. In the same time, he's going to talk to Prime Minister representing Palestinians to release the hostages, and overall messages that they both and all should work for political decision. But actually, the latest news here in the Netherlands is that he actually told Netanyahu to refrain and use less violence, which is absolutely amazing thing to say in the middle of some savage war where the most of the victims are civilians, not just civilians, children, elderly, women. Because, you know, it's almost like saying to junkie, use a little less heroin. You know, we are not talking here what is acceptable measure of violence, but we are actually talking here that the whole world, and especially leaders in a liberal world, in liberal democracies, need to do everything to stop Israel destroying Gaza. And Rutte is not there to say that. Rutte is there, obviously, to mitigate between all these interests that now we in a small see happening in the Netherlands, delivering from the storage owned by the United States the spare parts to Israel, and no one can imagine that Israel is not going to do this immediately for war actions. And by the way, it's very important to underline that the ruling of the court today said that the Netherlands could continue exporting and delivering spare parts to Israel if Israel would not use these to continue in Gaza, in a war affair in Gaza. And I think it's such a risky decision to make by the government to continue, because once you deliver and sell something to Israel, you obviously do not have any ownership further on. So within 7 days from the decision today, the Dutch government needs simply to stop exporting, regardless of High Court appeal of the government that we heard today is going to happen.
Nevenka, we thank you very much indeed. We appreciate your time. Nevenka Tromp there joining us live from The Hague.